All right, thank you. And hello, it's my pleasure to be with you today to discuss our work on understanding drivers of food choice. And I think it's a really nice follow-on to the presentations that we just heard. And I'll be talking about what, how, and why do people eat the way they do, and the methods that we have used across multiple projects and many of our collaborators as well. I'd first like to acknowledge my collaborators, my co-investigators that are listed here on the slide, and also our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So first, what is food choice? So food choice encompasses the processes by which individuals and households decide what, how, and why to acquire, store, prepare, distribute, and consume the food that they eat. Food choice is limited to what is available and accessible, and it's integral to social and economic expression of identities, preferences, and cultural values that ultimately influence dietary intake and health. Globally, livelihoods and food environments have been changing rapidly, as some of our participants were just talking about. We know with urbanization accelerating over the last 20 years, that's corresponded with changes in livelihood that have major implications for food choice. Specifically, food is becoming more purchased, more perishable, more processed and prepared, and that this transformation is not just happening in urban middle-class settings, but it's broad, it's in rural and urban areas across Africa and Asia, and across the income distribution. So achieving optimal and sustainable healthy diets requires understanding how people make food choices in these changing food environments, and specifically what, how, and why people eat the way they do. So the objective of the presentation that I'm giving today is to describe some of the study designs and corresponding methods that are useful for understanding drivers of food choice in these settings and experiencing changes in livelihoods and food environments. And I'll provide two examples to illustrate some of the methods and how they were combined across two different contexts. But first, as a bit of background, the examples I present below were funded by the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program. And the overarching objective of this program was to facilitate, synthesize, and disseminate research to provide a deep understanding of drivers of food choice among the poor in developing countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And the DFC program included 15 projects across 10 countries. And today I'm going to limit my discussion to the study design, methods, and key takeaways from two DFC projects, one in Guinea, West Africa, and the other in Malawi. So to identify drivers of food choice that guide to guide future program and policy action, it really is necessary to think about food choice from the perspective of what people eat, how they eat, and why they eat the way they do. So with clear objectives and a population description, we can answer three essential questions. So what is available and consumed in a given physical and economic, political, and socio-cultural context of the food environment? And then moving on from that, how do people acquire, prepare, distribute, and consume the food they eat within this context? And then to get at the drivers of choice and the drivers of those behaviors and ultimately the consumption of different foods, why do people make the food choices that they do? This yields information about decision-making processes for food choice and also the causal drivers of those choices. So the first project that I will discuss was conducted in Guinea, West Africa, and it was conceptualized and carried out by Dr. Rolf Clem and his colleagues, Peter Winch, Stella Nordhagen, Sadio Diala, and Alpha Umar Berry. And their objective was to depict how artisanal mining livelihoods impact food choices, with a particular focus on the choices women make for themselves and their young children. And looking at that, looking at their study in terms of the what, how, and why framework, they carried out a cross-sectional mixed methods design in a population across 18 mining sites in 2 districts in Kankan region in northeastern Guinea. They focused on women miners or wives, partners of miners who are caretakers for children under the age of 5 years old. They also interviewed young single miners, male and female, to get a different perspective, and food vendors. They included quantitative market surveys with 4 rounds covering 4 to 7 markets, and cross-sectional household surveys with 613 participants. They also completed qualitative mining site observations, food preparation observations, in-depth structured interviews, and 24-hour non-quantitative dietary recalls, and they used a slightly modified version of the standard DHS type questionnaire. Further, results from their observations and initial interviews were used to inform a second round of interviews with mothers. They specifically sought to understand the dietary intake of women and children and the food availability, price, vendor, and product properties to gain an understanding of what people were eating and what was available. They then focused on, in addition to knowing what was available, they focused on understanding how food was acquired and obtained. So measuring crop production, livestock raised, and then food acquisition and shopping practices. And to get at the drivers of choice, they specifically focused on accessibility and affordability, convenience and desirability, and then an emphasis on decision-making for food purchases and spending with regard to gender dynamics. So what did they learn? So they learned that diets for women and children in this context were poor, that only 23% of women and 21% of children met minimum dietary diversity, and that 28% of these households were severely food insecure. Further, mining households had limited access to food from their own production, and their nutrient-dense non-staple foods were scarce and pricey. Now, with just this information, we could stop here and have a pretty good idea of the nutrition situation among the miners in these settings who care for children. But what they really wanted to know is what is driving food choice that contributes to this situation that might be amenable to program and policy intervention. So their design allowed them to say how the Guinean miners caring for children eat. And they noted in particular that some participants chose to fast during work hours, and that families were dependent on markets that sell processed and packaged food at levels higher than expected in a rural area. And further, that women undertake a majority of the household and caring work plus substantial mining work. And that when combined with a lack of safe and affordable childcare options, this put a heavy burden on women's time for young child feeding. So to gain even more useful guidance for program and policy action, the research design allowed them to address why these decisions were made, or how these, why they were engaging in food behaviors in the way that they were. And they learned that a key driver of poor diet wasn't just income, it was income instability. And the income instability was not only a challenge for healthy diet, but it was exacerbated by gender inequities in both income and time use. And further, they articulated clearly through their results and had data to demonstrate that the societal expectations around gender roles were placing the heavy burden on women's time. Further, they identified across both vendors and participants that food safety concerns were driving both food choice behaviors and food availability, in part because both vendors and consumers were placing considerable value on ensuring that foods are clean and safe at the generally unhygienic mining sites. And in terms of the income instability, while the profession can afford opportunities to make substantially more money than agriculture, particularly for women, the income generation is highly variable and unpredictable, and it was having a serious impact on both the quality of diet and the security of their diet from day to day. Using this framework with a second example conducted in Malawi, this work was led by Dr. Valerie Flax and Chrissy Thakwalakwa from the University of Malawi, along with their colleagues Lindsay Jacks and John Puka. And they sought to identify and explain predictors of dietary intake and food choice among Malawian mother-child dyads containing an overweight mother, child, or both. They used a longitudinal mixed methods design, and they recruited urban and rural mother-child dyads, 274 in total. Mothers were at least 18 years of age, and children were between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. And they recruited in 3 categories: overweight mother, overweight child, overweight mother and normal weight child, and normal weight mother and overweight child across both urban and rural districts. They conducted quantitative surveys with mothers and household food logs, and qualitative in-depth interviews, drivers of food choice pile sort, and market trip observations, also with all of the mothers. They specifically sought to measure dietary intake of mothers and children, food insecurity, and morbidity to understand what was going on in the situation and what was the food consumption of both mothers and children. They wanted to understand behaviors, specifically infant and young child feeding practices and food shopping behavior practices, to understand how food was obtained and how food was distributed and given to children. And to understand why they focused on affordability, convenience, and desirability, also specifically taste preference, body size preferences, intra-household decision-making, and gender-related factors. So what did they learn? From this study, we learn that compared to dyads with a normal weight child, dyads with an overweight child had a higher percent of calories from carbohydrate and intake of grains, and a lower percent of calories from fat and intake of oils and fats, among other aspects of their dietary patterns. So this tells us a little bit about the dietary intake patterns, but nothing about eating habits or drivers of food choice. To provide more insight, the investigators describe how mothers obtain food for themselves and their children. And they learned that 83% shopped only at outdoor markets, 9% at outdoor and shops groceries, and 8% only at the shops and groceries. And that in these shopping trips, they were primarily purchasing the ingredients for the relish to accompany a stiff maize porridge, the staple food, but that additional foods were also purchased for the children's consumption and the family's consumption, including fruits, sweets, combo puffs, fried snacks, and sugar sweetened drinks. Further, they determined that 60% of mothers bought food specifically for their young child during the market trip, and that these were usually sweets, packaged snacks, fruits, or fried food. So this tells us a bit about where foods are coming from, what kinds of foods or situations might be contributing to poor diets that promote overweight, but why? So results from their pile sorts, interviews, and surveys suggest that greater than 50% of mothers wanted their child to be larger regardless of current weight status, and that was including for children who were in the overweight status. That child age, maternal body size preference, maternal taste preference, food quality, cost, household food security, and spending on special foods for children were the most consistent predictors of food group consumption for both mothers and children, and that included both healthy and unhealthy foods. So from these examples, we illustrate how to combine data to address what, how, and why to get at drivers of food choice. We know that people make food choices about how to acquire, store, prepare, distribute, and consume the food that they eat. And all of these decisions involve a variety of different considerations, including, in particular, cost, taste, convenience, and health. These are key considerations that drive food choice for most people, but how these are balanced in different settings varies quite widely. Addressing the interrelated questions of what, how, and why people eat the way they do can provide useful insight into drivers of food choice for program and policy action that go beyond answering just one of the questions in isolation. So countries seek to simultaneously address sustainable, healthy food choices that prevent undernutrition and obesity and chronic disease. Understanding these drivers of choice is necessary for promoting sustainable, healthy diets, for thinking about how to stimulate demand, for working to encourage environments that nudge toward healthier eating choices rather than unhealthy, and that interdisciplinary research teams with adequate and complementary expertise in both quantitative and qualitative research methods are essential for generating useful data to contribute to this aim. Thank you.